Ye gallants of Newgate, whose fingers are nice in diving of pockets or cogging of dice. Ye sharpers so rich who can buy off the noose. Ye honest poor rogues who will die in your shoes. Attendant, draw near, good news ye shall hear, how Jonathan's throat was cut from ear to ear. How blues can sharp penknife has set ye at ease. And every man round me may rob it.
Welcome back to Scoundrel's Alley. It's time for another Scoundrel Short. This time we're going to talk about playing cards. Cards are very important in the 18th century, singing, dancing, and card playing being the three most popular forms of entertainment. Then the next series of videos, we're going to be teaching you some of the card games to play, just a couple, 3, maybe 4. We haven't really got that time. Now I'm going to tell you right now, though, that the problem with using a period deck is most people aren't really quick. Decks do change over the years. We're going to talk about that in this video. But if I were to use a period deck to demonstrate this and our card games that we're going to be demonstrating, if I were to hold this card up and then put it down, I would say, what did you have? And I would hear anything from the 9 of clubs, the 10 of clubs, the Queen of spades, the 6 of diamonds. If I were to use a period deck and just say, what do I have? You'd immediately know that it was the 10 of clubs. I hope. So here at Scoundrel's Alley, we're all about educating, and because of that, we walk a very thin line between what is historically accurate and what we can teach and use a modern audience to understand. So even when I'm performing a card trick or playing a game or teaching a game in a historical setting, I tend to use a modern deck because, again, I want you to learn something. It's cool to sit around with your friends in a period environment and use a period deck, though it gets a bit confusing, so when you're first starting out, use a period deck. Now, again, this is a period. There's all sorts of decks you can get. If you want to look at get a period deck, I would suggest Samson Historical. I'll drop a link in the link below. They have everything from these kind. This is a period deck that I believe they still carry. This is the Cries of London. It's one of the fancier decks. You'd have the card up here, but then a woodcut and a saying from what you would have seen in London. This particular deck is a facsimile of a 1754 deck. Here in the colonies, if you're looking for a period deck, it would look a lot like that. It would not have the back card. This is a 19th century, early 19th century Anglo-American version of a deck of cards. You would have gotten them like this in the 18th century. It was illegal to print cards over here. It's been illegal to print cards, according to London, anywhere outside of London since about 1542. I'll talk about that in the video later. You'd be looking for this. That's the tax stamp. This is one of the issues that we got so upset about because this stamp wasn't repealed when some of the other ones were. On the frontier, you might have been playing with a deck like this. This is an actual 52 card deck. See the difference? Yeah. This was actually made for me many years ago. He was the man who did it was a paper maker. His wife was a block printer. This is the Queen of Spades. They were able to print these for me. He made the paper and she printed them up for me. I don't use them because they're really ungainly and wildy and very hard to use, but they're really good for demonstration and for me to say, hey, this is why I use a non-period deck. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, like I said, I'll drop a link. If you want a period deck, I'll drop a link to Samson's Historical's website, and you can find them there. Other than that, let's just get started. We'll head on over to the lecture hall, and, well, welcome to Scoundrel's Alley.
But now, what can be imagined more destructive of industry and a greater enemy to honest labor and more immediately calculated to draw men off from their usual callings and to render them idle and vagrant than this practice of gaming? For when mankind can be so far gulled and deceived in their hopes as to promise themselves more profit from 1 hour's play than from a year's labor, human nature will be apt to be too indulgent to itself and joyfully to embrace the scheme of much money and little trouble.
And that's the problem with guest lecturers. You tell them they got a couple minutes and they immediately want to start screaming and ranting and raving and hollering and preachifying at you and everything else. Should never have asked the parson to do it. Oh well, now we're to the good part of the lecture. I'll be your presenter today and your lecturer for this series of card games and a bit of the history of them. Now there's a lot to talk about and I can't cover it all. In fact, some of you will be going, wait a minute, you missed this part and this part and this part. Again, I just cannot cover it all. So let's talk briefly about the history of cards. Now cards themselves, the first mention that we can have of it was really in the Tang Dynasty in the 9th century. These are really tiles. They were wood-carved tiles, and they show a connection between dominoes and cards. The first reference we're going to see in Europe comes in Florence, in the notation dated 23 March 1376 by the city elders. They voted that, by a vote of 98 to 24, that a certain game called nab, recently introduced in these parts, is to be prohibited. It goes on to indicate that it's not a religious issue. It's rather the game was so captivating that employees were letting their work slack. Basically, the rich people were getting upset because the poor people had found something else to do other than doing what they were told to do. Now, where the cards came from, we're going to speculate a bit. We think it was out of Egypt, Mamluk Egypt, and probably through Portuguese sailors. The first connection with really meat on it, John of Rheinfelden. He was a Swiss Dominican monk, and of course John of Rheinfelden, we obviously know he was from, Freiburg. He writes that, thus it is said that a certain game called cards has reached us in the present year, namely 1377. Now he'll go on to describe them as, again, 52 cards, 4 suits, 10 pips, 3 court cards. He describes some manner of play, how to play them, and how they can be used to the betterment of society. Now that's going to come into play in a little bit, because when we think of cards, we don't think of any betterment of society, but yet the Swiss monk is going to outline some ways that it does make us better. Now the major change that we're going to see is going to come in the suits. For instance, the Germans, they had the hearts, the bells, the acorn, and the leaves. The French will have the hearts, the piles, what they call the piles, the clovers, and pikes. And it's about 1477 that we see that. The French cards, they're the most widespread, and it was due to the geopolitical, commercial, and cultural influence they had. And the simplicity of the suits insignia. That's going to simplify mass production, and with the advent and popularity of whist, we'll spread it out. Now, when it exports to England, what we're going to do is we're going to take the 3 court cards, or the coat cards, the 3 men on those, and change one to a woman. So now we have the knave, the queen, and the king. Later on, the knave will be changed to a jack when we put in dices on it. The other difference that we're going to have is we're going to change the names. The suits will stay the same, just like the French. The French have the hearts, the piles, the clovers, and the pikes. We're just going to change some names. The piles become diamonds, and the clovers become clubs, and the pikes become spades. The English pattern of French suited cards is so widespread today that it's also known as the international or the Anglo-American pattern. It's impossible to talk about history of cards without, of course, mentioning Edmund Hoyle. He was born in 1672 and died in 1769. But we do know that he wrote a book on card playing. Very specifically, he wrote a book that included backgammon, whist, the game of whist, and horse racing. It was called A Short Treatise on the Game of Whist. In 1742, it sold for the high price of 1 guinea. Now, in addition to buying the manuscript, he also provided himself for 12 lessons, though he wasn't considered a very good whist player. Whist was so popular, and it is the most popular game of all time that we can find, actually. Now, that was really the only thing Hoyle ever wrote. Most of the information, when I'm looking at old sources, Charles Cotton in 1677 wrote an excellent treatise called The Complete Gamester. The edition that I use is the 1722 edition. Speaking of whist, in the 1722 edition, Charles Cotton actually writes that the game is so well known that he's not going to bother writing how to play the game. He doesn't even write the rules down. Everyone over the age of 8, according to him, would know how to play it. So in his section on whist, he doesn't teach us how to play the game. He talks about how to cheat at the game. Now, there were some issues in playing cards. I know, hard to believe, but there were. As early as 1452, John Capistrano, he was known as the Soldier Saint, came out against them. Now, why this is important is because John Capistrano was known as the greatest orator of his time. The largest churches in Europe could not hold the crowds, so he ended up preaching in the public squares. There's one reference in Brescia in Italy that he preached to a crowd of over 126,000 people. One of the times that he was preaching against the vice of gaming and slothfulness. He was so moving to people, and they were so impressed with what he said, that they ended up building a bonfire. It said it consisted of 76 sledges, over 3,640 backgammon boards, and 40,000 sets of dice and cards. If this seems like a lot, remember that he preached in Italy for 126,000 people. This guy could really speak and talk up a storm. I'd like to point out, though, that when he talks about gaming in the time period, and even until the 18th century, when you refer to gaming, you're talking about any entertainment that uses an outside source. So, tag is not gaming, but jump rope would be considered gaming. In 1463, Edward IV, he made it illegal to import cards into London. He did that to protect the London printers because by this time period, this is becoming a big business, very, very big business. In 1541, Henry VII, he expressly forbids playing of cards by servants or apprentices except during the Christmas season and then only at the master's house. Now, this, again, is a throwback to what we had earlier when we had the issue that Florence was looking at, because it wasn't anything wrong morally, except that the servants weren't getting the work done, so the everything was grinding to a halt. But on the other hand, the punishment for this, for getting caught playing outside of the Christmas season, was a fine of 6 shillings and 8 pence. And it was fined to the homeowner wherever you were playing the cards at. It kind of throws back to the idea of the tithing being responsible of the individual that we've talked about in one of our earlier videos on the law. Well, his son, Henry VIII, he's going to extend this up in an act that forbids all sports on pretty much all the time, especially on Christmas Day, with the exception of archery. In the Unlawful Games Act of 1541, or the Suppression of Unlawful Games, the Act of 1541. It was an act of Parliament by England, and it was designed to prohibit several of the new, what they called the new design games, include cards, that caused the decay of archery. Now, because of what they learned with Henry V's victory in 1415 at the Battle of Agincourt, archery had become a very, very important deal. Gambling was still legal under the English common law, but the government worried that it interfered with the military training, so the Unlawful Games Act of 1541 made all gambling illegal. Now, this law that it was never enforced, but it did mean that gambling debts could not be collected through court action. And these laws stay on the books until the Gaming Act of 1845, and it actually repealed much of the Unlawful Games Act of 1541. 1845. Ugh. Now, in the private sphere, there's a distinctly different style of gaming that was taking place in the upper and the middle and the working classes. The upper classes, of course, gambling the family fortune away was very common, hence the warning about Lanterloo and things like that. These are called deep play, high stakes, high losses, called deep play. The only really positive that we see is that the venue that these were taking place at was usually in private clubs, and the atmosphere there controlled the violence and the really horrid behavior that you're going to see in the middle and lower class. The middle class, of course, you become recreational gambling at home was moderate, limited stakes, mostly for camaraderie and genial conversation rather than winning money. You also saw this a lot at the coffee shops. This is where Hoyle really made his play, with whist becoming so popular at the coffee shops. The middle class rejected the blood sports that the poor were fawning all over, and they decided that music, conversation, and cards better suited the taste for intellect and their ability. So they let their young play as well. The young, they thought, would then learn how to calculate quickly, making their minds better for a business, and account for money lost and won. For the poor people, it was just what they did to while away the time and also to get whatever they could. They tried to survive, and the best way to survive was if you had a slight ability to play the deck of cards, you played with a deck of cards. Here in this country, one of the biggest problems we have with cards is the Stamp Act of 1765. It was put into play to pay for the French and Indian War, and one of the acts was a stamp on cards. Now, if you remember earlier, like I said, it was illegal to print cards anywhere outside of London. They kept control of it. So when we all got over here, and the average family in colonial America is going to play about 10 decks of cards a year, they're a little upset because I can't print my own cards. I'm going to pay for this. And this was one of many of the stamp acts most people tend to forget. Before the Tea Party, most of the stamp acts were repealed. The stamp acts on cards never was. Finally, we're going to touch very quickly on tarot. It's become popular. It's a lot of the reenactments that we're going to is that somebody will sit under a tree and tell fortunes and read from a tarot cards, tarot decks. This didn't occur in the 18th century. Using it for cartomancy, to believe that it has some esoteric links to ancient Egypt, Iran, the Kabbalah, the Tantra, the I Ching. What we do find out through actual scholars' research and not just what we pick up on the internet, that tarot cards were probably invented in northern Italy around the 15th century, though there's no historical evidence that it was ever used for tarot or divination until very late in the 18th century, and then just very briefly. What it was, and Italian had a tarot deck, Spain had a tarot deck. You saw a lot of tarot decks in Germany. They were memory games. They were very complicated memory games. In the late 18th century, there is supposedly a Freemason who sees a deck for the first time, claims that it is part of the mystery of the mad Arab, the Necronomicon. But there's just no evidence that it was ever anything but a memory game. So that's a brief history of the cards, and quite frankly, thus endeth the lecture. We'll turn it back over to our gamer. Well, that's a bit of the history of early card game, or the early game of cards, or and how it kind of came to be. There's a lot more we could go into, but we just don't have the time. Coming up in the next few videos, we're going to be teaching you a couple of those card games you might want to play. A Rant or Go Round, a good family game, Vinkdunt, early form of 21. Now, there's other games, of course, that were popular in the 17th all the way through the 20th century, like Pharaoh, that, to be honest with you, by the 19th century, you're going to be hard-pressed to find a Pharaoh game that was actually dealt honestly. There was Bluff that will eventually turn into poker. Brag was played during the Gunpowder Revolution. Poor guys, they were just trying to play a game, then they got wrapped up in something else. The next thing you know, they're all hanged. Lanterloo, or Loo, which, if you're going to play it, you might want to play limited because it was known for people to lose lands, houses, people, clothing, themselves. It was an easy game to lose, but a fun game to play. There's always 31, or Perrin, Post and Bell, the 17th century Irish game that survives today. My grandmother loved it. It was her favorite game. There's also cribbage. You could be playing cribbage as well. Cribbage has been around again since the 17th century. It's a game, though, that unfortunately you have to be careful how you play it. My daughter learned it, played it often, played it early on. She also should have learned the important lesson that she didn't learn was if you're going to play that game in college, you might want to let your professors win every once in a while. I guess finally the really thing you have to do is not to figure out what game you want to play. More importantly is who you want to play the game with. And that's about it. If you have any questions, comments, whatever, like to know more about the games, follow the links below to learn how to play some of the games. You can also, again, comments, Eric at Fairwinds or Eric at scoundrelsalley.net. If you can want to talk to Frank or Carol, reach them at parsonjohn.org. As usual, anything you have to say about the comments, questions, Scoundrels Alley, Fairwinds, Parson John, the news organization, just drop us a line and let us know. And other than that, we will see you, well, in the next video.
Leave him but a crown. Some say there are peers and some parliament men who meet once a year to rob courtiers again. Let them all take their swing to pillage the king and get a blue ribbon instead of a string. Now blueskins sharp penknife has set ye at ease, and every man round me may rob if he please.